A Murder is Announced. The Truth Behind the Newspaper AD. Part 1. The Announcement, the Social Gathering, and the First Shot. The year is 1950. The dust of war has settled over England, but the rationing, the make-do-and-mend existence, remains. This is a world of Chipping Cleghorn, a quintessential English village, picturesque, predictable, and, above all, quiet. In a time of austerity, the greatest luxuries are privacy and routine. But routine is a mask. And in the quiet corners of this village, the post-war struggle for survival and status has created a dense web of economic necessity and small, whispered lies. Our story centers on one house, Little Paddocks. It's the home of Miss Letitia Blacklock, a woman of middle age and precise habits. Little Paddocks is not merely a house, it's a lifeboat. Miss Blacklock, while respectable, is not wealthy enough to support her lifestyle alone. So, she has tenants, the flamboyant younger couple, the Hames, and the frail, aging Dora Bunner, or Bunny, a childhood friend kept on as a companion. Living with Miss Blacklock are two younger cousins she seems to tolerate more than enjoy, Patrick Simmons and his sister, Julia. The house is full, the atmosphere is strained, and the finances are perpetually tight. On the morning of Friday, October 29th, the quiet lie of Chipping Cleghorn was shattered by the most peculiar notice to ever appear in the local gazette. The advertisement was small, tucked away in the classified section. A single brazen sentence. A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October 29th, at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. The village reacted with a blend of confusion, amusement, and a touch of horror. Was it a joke? A challenge? A new kind of party game? Miss Blacklock certainly thought it was a joke. When her maid, Mitzi, brought the paper, screaming about devils and horrors, Miss Blacklock assumed it was a mischievous young cousin, Patrick, having a prank. She was annoyed, but also intrigued. She decided to treat it as a curious novelty. She would allow her neighbors to come, watch the game, and see who was foolish enough to fall for it. The clock ticked toward 6:30. The parlor at Little Paddocks began to fill. The attendees made up the polite, curious core of the village. There were Colonel and Mrs. Easterbrook, Mrs. Swettenham, the village gossip, and her timid son, Edmund, and the sharp-eyed, practical Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife. They were all there for the spectacle. The guests made polite, nervous conversation, constantly glancing at the clock and the door. Meanwhile, inside Little Paddocks, the tension was internal. Patrick was lounging, denying the prank with too much amusement. Julia was coolly dismissive. Bunny was agitated, worrying about the fuss and whether Miss Blacklock was truly safe. Miss Blacklock herself remained composed, holding court, slightly flattered by the sudden attention. 6:29. The air grew thick with anticipation. The clock on the mantelpiece began to strike 6:30. Everyone leaned forward, and then the lights went out. The parlor was plunged into complete, suffocating darkness. The guests gasped. For a moment, there was only confusion. Then, two things happened in rapid succession. First, a door was flung open, letting in a shaft of light from a hole. Second, a voice shouted, sharp and foreign, "Stick up your hands! Stick up your hands!" This was no joke. The unmistakable, loud report of a pistol was heard, followed by a crash and a collective scream. In the moment of terrifying noise, only the practical instinct of Mrs. Harmon worked. She fumbled for her bicycle lamp and switched it on, casting a sudden, erratic beam of light around the room. What they saw froze the blood in every spectator. Miss Blacklock stood by the mantelpiece, bleeding from her ear, her face pale with shock. In front of her, sprawled on the floor, dead, was a young man, a stranger, clutching a small, cheap automatic pistol. The police arrived, led by the astute local inspector, Dermot Craddock. The first, crucial question was the identity of the dead man. Who was the stranger who burst into Little Paddocks, holding a pistol, just as the lights failed? It was quickly established that he was Rudy Schertz, a young Swiss hotel clerk who had been temporarily working at the Royal Spa Hotel nearby. But why was he here? And more importantly, who was his target? Inspector Craddock's initial theory, the obvious one, was that Rudy Schertz was a prankster, that he had orchestrated the advertisement as part of a botched robbery. But this explanation fell apart immediately. The gun was cheap, the timing was absurdly public, and more to the point, why was the victim of the robbery bleeding? Craddock found the truth by listening to Miss Blacklock's account. She had been standing by the mantelpiece. When the lights went out, she heard the door open and the demand. She had simply said, "Oh, it's you," assuming it was Patrick playing a trick. And that was a vital clue. Rudy Shirts was not there to rob the guests. He wasn't even there to shoot himself. He was there to shoot Miss Blacklock. Craddock's team concluded. The switch must have been short-circuited. The flash of the gun, that's what caught her ear. He came in, demanded their money, and then deliberately shot at Miss Blacklock. Rudy Shirts was an accomplice, a hired hand, brought in to stage a robbery that would cover the intended murder of Letitia Blacklock. But who hired him? The real killer was in that room, or in the house, watching. They were the ones who short-circuited the fuse. They were the ones who used Shirts as a perfect, expendable patsy. The first shot of the evening missed its intended target, Miss Letitia Blacklock. But it set in motion a chain of events far deadlier than anyone could imagine. The killer had failed once, and they would not fail again. Part 2. Introducing Inspector Craddock and the Randall Goedler fortune. The moment Inspector Craddock established that Rudy Shirts was not the perpetrator, but the victim of a meticulously planned hit, the entire investigation pivoted. This was no longer a local matter. It was murder by design, targeting the respectable Miss Letitia Blacklock. The immediate question, why? Miss Blacklock seemed harmless, slightly poor, and entirely conventional. But Craddock knew that violence of this scale only follows something enormous. And behind the facade of austerity at Little Paddocks lay a fortune so vast it could buy and sell the entire village of Chipping Cleghorn. The key to the crime lay in Randall Goedler. Randall Goedler was the head of a hugely wealthy international concern. When he died suddenly in the past year, he left a will. He had 2 living relatives, his sister, Charlotte, who was married to a Swiss doctor and presumed dead, and his other sister, Letitia, who had left England years ago to work for Goedler. The will was simple and absolute. Randall Goedler's entire fortune, estimated at over $2 million, an astronomical sum in 1950, was left to Letitia Blacklock. Suddenly, Miss Blacklock wasn't just a respectable spinster, she was one of the wealthiest women in England, and this enormous inheritance provided the perfect, crystal-clear motive for her murder. Craddock immediately turned his gaze on the collection of economic refugees living under Little Paddocks' roof. Everyone in that house stood to gain if Letitia Blacklock died. First, the 2 younger cousins, Patrick and Julia Simmons. They maintained their innocence, claiming they lived there simply out of convenience. But if Miss Blacklock were to die, the Goedler money would revert to an earlier will be distributed among distant relatives, meaning Patrick and Julia were likely heirs. But the inheritance also carried a crucial stipulation. Randall Goedler had 2 long-lost nephews or nieces who, if they could prove their identity, would share in the estate. These were the children of Randall's estranged third sister, Pip and Emma Goedler. Craddock and his superior, Superintendent Spence, deduced a real, sophisticated gambit. The killer intended to eliminate Miss Blacklock so that they, or someone they were colluding with, could step forward and claim to be the long-lost Pip or Emma, securing the massive fortune. The suspects list became dangerously sharp. Asterisk Patrick and Julia Simmons. Were they the true Pip and Emma, living under assumed names to monitor their aunt? Asterisk Philippa Hames, the young widow, a paying guest, beautiful and silent. She had a daughter she was desperately trying to support. Was she secretly Pip or Emma? Asterisk the entire household. They all had the means to place the ad and short-circuit the lights. The investigation was quickly getting nowhere. The suspects lied effortlessly. The maid, Mitzi, offered wild, impossible accusations. The only person in Chipping Cleghorn who saw through the lies was about to arrive. From the nearby village of St. Mary Mead came an elderly, unassuming woman on a visit to a friend. She was dismissed by the police as a sweet, interfering old day. Her name was Miss Jane Marple, and she was the only person who understood that this complex crime was not about money alone, but about the deeply rooted psychology of a liar. Miss Marple observed the house and its inhabitants not as a police inspector looks at a list of suspects, but as a seasoned villager looks at a garden full of weeds. She saw the unnatural growth, the things that didn't belong. In Part 3, Miss Marple joins the investigation, and the true, desperate nature of the household's post-war deception is finally recognized. Part 3. Enter Miss Marple in the Village of Lies. Inspector Craddock, a career policeman, dealt in facts, statements, and alibis. Miss Marple dealt in human nature. She knew that a village was a microcosm of the world, and every lie told in Chipping Cleghorn had its mirror in St. Mary Mead. When she stepped into Little Paddocks, she didn't see suspects. She saw characters playing roles. Craddock's initial line of inquiry focused on the small, practical lie, Rudy's shirts. Craddock confirmed that Shirts had received a note telling him to place the ad and appear at the house, demanding money while the lights were out. The note promised him £50 if he did so. He was a perfect pawn. But Miss Marple focused on the large, psychological lie, the identity of everyone in the house. The entire post-war household was defined by economic refugees, people forced into false roles to maintain respectability or solvency. Asterisk Julia and Patrick Simmons, they claimed to be cousins. Were they the A's, Pip and Emma, waiting for the right moment? Asterisk Mitzi, the maid. She was a volatile, self-pitying refugee who constantly claimed everyone was trying to murder her. Was her hysteria a genuine reaction to persecution, or a theatrical performance designed to mask a more calculated role? Asterisk the Goedler A's, the mystery of Pip and Emma loomed. Craddock learned they had been separated in childhood. The killer needed to be one of them, or needed to successfully impersonate one of them. Miss Marple quietly observed the burnt table in the parlor, a small detail from the night of the murder. The bullet had grazed Miss Blacklock and lodged itself in the wall. The lamp had a short circuit. The table by the mantelpiece was scorched. The killer, Miss Marple intuited, was not only clever but meticulous, using a simple electrical fault to achieve their end. But the investigation took a chaotic turn with a flurry of accusations and counter-accusations. Patrick revealed that Mitzi, the maid, had a clear motive. Julia, on the other hand, suspected Patrick. The village gossip, Mrs. Swetenham, provided a steady stream of misinformation. As the police struggled with the chaos, Miss Marple pointed to the only person who seemed incapable of a lie, Dora Bunner, Bunny. Bunny was Miss Blacklock's frail, confused companion. She was a constant, distracting stream of babbling nonsense. But amidst her confusion, she kept repeating one thing. It's a funny kind of clock. He keeps setting it back. You know, I don't know why. We all know who it is. We all know. It's her. She shouldn't have changed the name. Bunny's comments about the changed name were dismissed as senile rambling. Who changed their name? And what did it have to do with the murder? Miss Marple saw in Bunny's confusion not madness, but the unbearable burden of holding a truth too big for her small mind. She was a witness the police overlooked. The killer, realizing the danger Bunny posed, would soon take steps to silence her forever. The relative quiet of Chipping Cleghorn was about to be shattered by a second, far more tragic murder. Part 4. The second murder, Bunny's fatal mistake. Bunny knew something. The police knew it. Miss Marple knew it. And most critically, the killer knew it. Bunny's ramblings were a clear and present danger to the sophisticated plot unfolding at Little Paddocks. Her confusion was lethal because she could blurt out a vital truth without even realizing its significance. Bunny was concerned about a medicine, Miss Blacklock's favorite aspirin. Miss Blacklock was suffering from terrible headaches following the gunshot wound, and she was constantly taking her medication. The opportunity came on the day of the birthday party for Colonel Easterbrook. Miss Blacklock was given a dose of aspirin by Bunny for a terrible headache. Bunny, in her characteristic fumbling, gave Miss Blacklock the dose just before a party. Later that evening, Bunny complained of a terrible headache herself. Miss Blacklock told Bunny to take one of the remaining tablets from the bottle on her bedside table. The following morning, Dora Bunner was found dead in her bed. Cause of death, poisoning by a massive dose of aspirin. It was a cold, brutal, and simple act. It was a targeted assassination of the only person who possessed the key, the only person who could, in a confused way, identify the fraud. The killer intended to kill Miss Blacklock with a poisoned aspirin on the night of the party, using the excuse of her headache. But Bunny, in her fumbling, had mixed up the bottles. Miss Blacklock took the real aspirin. Bunny took the poisoned one. The killer was clearly watching and, upon realizing their mistake, knew they had to ensure Bunny ingested the poison immediately to cover their track. This second murder was devastating for the investigation, but it confirmed three things for Miss Marple. Asterisk, the killer was ruthless and highly determined. Asterisk, the killer was someone in Little Paddocks who had access to Miss Blacklock's medication. Asterisk, Bunny's ramblings were the absolute truth. The police immediately focused on Bunny's most coherent statement. She shouldn't have changed the name. Craddock's team followed the paper trail, eventually making the key discovery. The identity of Miss Letitia Blacklock was fake. The real Letitia Blacklock was the one who was supposed to be dead. Randall Goedler had two sisters named Letitia and Charlotte. Charlotte had been institutionalized in a Swiss sanatorium for years, following a nervous breakdown. The woman living at Little Paddocks, the apparent heiress, was actually Charlotte Blacklock, who had come home from Switzerland. Charlotte had been pretending to be her dead sister, Letitia, in order to claim the enormous Goedler fortune. Charlotte Blacklock, the woman who had miraculously survived the first shooting, was an identity thief, an inheritance fraudster. The entire household was a stage, and the star was Charlotte Blacklock, desperately trying to maintain her dead sister's identity. Suddenly, the motive wasn't about gaining the inheritance. It was about protecting a fraudulent claim to it. Someone knew Charlotte's true identity and was trying to kill her before she could fully secure the Goedler money. The prime suspect was the only person who could have known Charlotte's real face, Pippo Emma, the heir who stood to lose everything if the fraud succeeded. Part 5. The technical clue, lamp, violets, and the short circuit. The revelation of the supposed victim, Miss Blacklock, was actually Charlotte Blacklock, the supposed dead sister, changed the police's perspective. They had been protecting the criminal all along. The pressure intensified to find the real Pip and Emma Goedler, the legitimate heirs, who were now clearly fighting to expose a fraud and claim their own inheritance. Craddock, in his frustration, returned to the two major verifiable facts, the first murder and the second. Miss Marple, however, remained focused on the tiny, domestic details, the burnt table, the missing light bulb, and the vase of dead flowers. She analyzed the technical mechanics of the first murder, the short circuit. The killer had used an electric clock to plug into a lamp socket, short-circuiting the fuse at exactly 6:30 p.m. This perfectly timed the blackout for Rudy's shirt's entrance. The electric clock was later found, burned out. Miss Marple realized the brilliance of the device. It was both the murder weapon and the perfect decoy. It pointed to an outsider, shirts, when the mechanism was clearly set up by someone inside the house. She also analyzed the position of Miss Blacklock during the shooting. She was standing by the mantelpiece. The burnt table was nearby. Then, there were the dead violets. A small vase of dead violets was on the mantelpiece on the night of the murder. The following day, they were gone. Miss Marple learned that Miss Blacklock hated the smell of violets and had asked a young girl in the village to replace them with something else. Why was the killer focused on those specific flowers? Miss Marple connected the dots, the position, the scent, and the lamp. The burnt table was caused not by the pistol flash, but by the short circuit. The dead violets were the alibi. A person near the mantelpiece would be obscured by the initial flash of the short-circuiting lamp. If that person was allergic to violets, they would have a reason to move away from the mantelpiece quickly, creating a diversion. The killer was relying on the fact that no one would notice a brief repositioning of the supposed victim. Just as Miss Marple was solving the mechanics, the mystery of the heirs took a sudden, dramatic turn. Julia Simmons, the cool, detached cousin, cornered Craddock. She confessed everything. Julia stated, "You've wasted your time looking for me. I've been here all along. I am Emma Goedler." Julia Simmons was Emma. She was a rightful heir, hiding in plain sight, using the cover of Cousin to observe the fraudulent Charlotte Blacklock. If Julia was Emma, then who was Pip, the male heir? And was Pip the killer? The remaining suspects were narrowed down to the only others who could be Pip, Patrick Simmons, or possibly Philippa Hames. But Miss Marple's instinct screamed that the police were still missing the core psychological truth. The killer was still in the house, watching, manipulating confusion, and the ultimate trap was about to be sprung. Part 6. The third murder, the positional clue. With Julia's admission that she was Emma Goedler, the pieces of the inheritance puzzle were clicking into place. The fraud was confirmed. Emma was in the house. The killer must be Pip, the other heir, who was attempting to eliminate the fraudulent Charlotte Blacklock before claiming the fortune with his sister. The prime suspect was now Patrick Simmons. But the police were ignoring the other person who knew the truth, Miss Murgatroyd. Miss Murgatroyd was one of the local neighbors present at Little Paddocks on the night of the first murder. She and her friend, Miss Hinchcliffe, an intimidating, sensible woman, had spent weeks dissecting the event of that night. Miss Murgatroyd was focused on the position of everyone in the room. She kept saying, "But I saw everyone. There was only one person who wasn't there. Who moved? The light was behind them." Miss Murgatroyd was moments away from identifying the person whose location on the night of the murder was obscured by the beam of the torch. The killer knew this. They had to silence the reliable, sensible observers. Miss Murgatroyd and Miss Hinchcliffe were talking in the garden of Miss Hinchcliffe's home. Miss Hinchcliffe left for a brief moment to tend to her dog. When Miss Hinchcliffe returned, Miss Murgatroyd was lying on the ground. She had been brutally strangled. The third murder. A desperate, immediate action. The killer was now panicked. Miss Hinchcliffe, distraught, had one last, critical memory, Miss Murgatroyd's final words. Before she was attacked, Miss Murgatroyd had been discussing the party, and she had suddenly looked at the path, just as the killer approached. She didn't scream a name. She simply said, in a moment of chilling recognition, "Oh, I thought you were... Oh, but it was someone else." Miss Murgatroyd was strangled before she could complete the sentence. She recognized the killer, but she had momentarily confused them with someone else. The person obscured by the torchlight was a killer, and they had just been unmasked. Miss Marple now saw the full picture. The killer was protecting the original fraud. The killer was Charlotte Blacklock. But how could she have shot herself and killed Rudy Shirts at the same time? And who, then, was Pip? Part 7. The Psychological Trap. The Final Confrontation. 3 murders. Rudy Shirts, Dora Bunner, and Miss Murgatroyd. All of them connected to the initial, sophisticated fraud committed by Charlotte Blacklock, the woman posing as a dead sister, Letitia. Miss Marple knew the true sequence of events on the night of the murder. Asterisk reparation. Charlotte, having learned that Rudy Shirts would be arriving at 6:30 p.m., set the short-circuiting lamp and placed a newspaper ad. Asterisk the black hat. At 6:30 p.m., the lights failed. Asterisk the act. Charlotte, standing by the mantelpiece, held the gun. When Shirts burst in, she immediately shot him dead. Asterisk the staging. Before Mrs. Harmon's torch came on, Charlotte quickly grazed her own ear with a second bullet from the small automatic pistol. This allowed her to bleed and play the role of the victim, claiming Shirts had shot her. Asterisk the alibi. The dead violets were crucial. Charlotte, being Charlotte and not Letitia, was allergic to violets. Her movement away from the mantelpiece as a result of the fake allergy explained why she was no longer positioned exactly where she had been when the lights went out, thus obscuring the fact that she was the one holding the gun. Charlotte was playing both the victim and the judge. She killed the pawn, Shirts, and secured her alibi simultaneously. But 2 major questions remained. Who was Pip? And how could Craddock and Miss Marple force Charlotte to confess when her act was so perfect? Miss Marple gathered Craddock and Superintendent Spence. The time for observation was over. The time for a calculated risk had arrived. The missing heir, Pip, had to be revealed. Miss Marple knew that the one person who remained quiet, who was dismissed as merely a desperate young woman, was the answer. Miss Marple produced a family letter confirming the details of the Goedler children. She then called in Philippa Hames. Miss Marple informed Craddock that Philippa was, in fact, Pip Goedler, the male heir. Philippa admitted it. She was Pip, but she was not the killer. She had been observing Charlotte, trying to find a way to expose the fraud legally. Now, all the pieces were assembled. Emma, Julia, and Pip Philippa were revealed. The fraud, Charlotte, was known. Only the final proof of the murders remained. Miss Marple and Craddock devised a psychological trap. They decided to appeal to the one person Charlotte Blacklock genuinely cared about, Bunny, Dora Bunner. They planned to tell Charlotte that Bunny had miraculously recovered and was about to reveal the final, missing piece of the puzzle. The emotional stress of believing the victim had returned from the grave would, they hoped, force the killer's composure to break. The final confrontation was set. Part 8. The full revelation and the choker's secret. The trap was sprung in the cold, tense parlor of Little Paddocks. Miss Marple, Craddock, and Superintendent Spence confronted Charlotte Blacklock. They laid out the evidence, the short circuit, the self-inflicted wound, the deliberate poisoning of Bunny, and then the final psychological blow. Craddock stated, "We have good news, Miss Blacklock. Dora Bunner is alive. She is coming here, and she is going to tell us who shot Rudy Shirts." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The cool, collected demeanor of Charlotte Blacklock shattered. She screamed, not in denial, but in a final, agonizing moment of fear and despair. Charlotte cried. She can't. She was a fool. She would have ruined everything. She knew. Charlotte Blacklock confessed. The years of maintenance, the sheer effort of keeping up the facade, the 3 subsequent murders to protect the core lie, it all collapsed in one final, broken cry. The full, shocking plot was finally laid bare. The original Charlotte Blacklock had truly suffered a nervous breakdown and had been sent to a Swiss sanatorium. Her sister, Letitia, visited her. During one of these visits, the real Letitia died of natural causes. Charlotte saw her chance. She had always been the stronger, more dominant sister. She was consumed by bitterness and a desire for the fortune. She secretly buried Letitia in Switzerland and returned to England, assuming her dead sister's identity, Letitia Blacklock, the sole heir. But there was a problem. A tiny scar on Charlotte's neck from a childhood surgery, which the real Letitia did not possess. If anyone who knew the sisters well saw it, the fraud would be instantly exposed. This led to the crucial, tiny detail that Miss Marple had been focused on all along, the choker's secret. Charlotte Blacklock never wore anything but a high-neck sweater or a thick, 3-strand pearl choker. The choker was not an accessory. It was a deadly disguise, perfectly concealing the telltale scar on her neck. The final, tragic piece of the puzzle was Dora Bunner. Bunny, in her confusion, kept saying she shouldn't have changed the name. Bunny had known both sisters. She knew the difference between the quiet, kind Letitia and the harsher, more dominant Charlotte. Her final, confused words were not about the heirs changing their names, but about the woman in front of her changing Hayes. The ultimate goal of the newspaper ad murder was simple, to eliminate Pip and Emma as suspect by framing the initial crime as a botched robbery, while simultaneously eliminating anyone who knew the truth about the Swiss sanatorium and the real fate of Letitia. Charlotte Blacklock, the sophisticated fraudster who had staged her own death and stolen her sister's identity, was finally exposed not by forensic evidence, but by a psychological trap and the meticulous observation of an elderly woman who understood the deadly gravity of small, human lies. In the end, the massive Randall Goedler fortune went to the rightful heirs, Pip, Philippa Hames, and Emma, Julia Simmons, finally ending the era of economic desperation and identity fraud at Little Paddocks.